The tunnel mouth yawned like a wound in the mountain, 30 feet wide and perfectly arched, carved by men who'd dreamed of connecting Denver to the western slope through Hoosier Pass. The dream had died in 1875, when funding collapsed and winter killed 3 workers in an avalanche. Now, in the spring of 1878, the tunnel stood empty. 500 feet of hand-drilled stone passage leading nowhere. A monument to abandoned ambition. Thomas Brennan stood at the entrance, feeling the cool air exhale from the darkness. At 35, he'd worked on enough railroad tunnels to know good engineering when he saw it. The arch was solid, the walls were competent stonework, and the constant seepage that plagued most tunnels was minimal here. The mountain's granite bones shed water efficiently. "It's perfect," he said. His wife, Sarah, 29 and practical as sunrise, looked at the dark opening with less enthusiasm. "It's a hole in a mountain, Thomas." "It's a perfectly engineered hole in a mountain," he corrected. "With natural temperature regulation, protection from wind and weather, and stone walls that will never burn or rot. We could build inside, make a proper home." Sarah had been a nurse in Denver before marrying Thomas, tending to railroad workers and miners who came down from the mountains broken in various ways. She'd learned to evaluate risk, to weigh the likely against the merely possible. "People will think we're insane." "People already think we're eccentric for homesteading at 10,000 feet, Thomas replied. He'd filed a claim on 160 acres of high-altitude land that included the tunnel entrance, land other settlers had rejected as too steep, too cold, too difficult. But Thomas understood mountains, understood engineering, and understood that sometimes the hardest solutions were the smartest ones. They'd met when he'd been brought to her clinic with a hand crushed in a tunnel boring accident. She'd saved his fingers, and he'd fallen in love with her competent calm and the way she explained medical procedures like engineering problems. When they married, she'd agreed to follow him to the high country, but she'd expected a conventional cabin, not this. "Show me how it would work," she said finally. They walked into the tunnel together, their footsteps echoing. Sunlight penetrated perhaps 80 feet before fading to dimness. The tunnel floor was level, carefully graded for the rails that had never been laid. The walls showed drill marks from the miners' work, precise holes where black powder charges had been set to blast through the granite. The arch overhead was a perfect semicircle, engineered to distribute the mountain's weight efficiently. "Temperature," Thomas said, his voice echoing. "Right now it's probably 45 degrees in here. In winter, when it's 20 below outside, it'll still be 45 degrees. In summer, when it's 90 outside, it'll still be 45 degrees. The mountain is thermal mass. It absorbs and releases heat so slowly that the interior temperature barely changes." He pulled a candle from his pack and lit it, watching the flame. It burned steadily, not guttering. "Good ventilation. The tunnel breathes. Warm air rises and draws fresh air in from outside. We won't suffocate." Sarah walked farther in, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. About 100 feet from the entrance, a natural alcove in the wall caught her attention, a place where the tunnel widened slightly, perhaps where the workers had stored equipment. "Here?" she asked. "Here," Thomas agreed. "Close enough to the entrance for light and ventilation. Far enough in for temperature stability and protection from storms. We build a cabin against the tunnel wall. Proper walls, roof, floor, windows. Like a house, but with a stone mountain for insulation instead of thin wooden walls." The mockery started the moment they mentioned their plans in the settlement of Hoosier Junction, a collection of rough buildings at the base of the pass, serving the few hardy souls who tried to make a living at altitude. "A tunnel?" Jacob Morrison, owner of the general store, laughed so hard he had to set down the bag of flour he was weighing. "You're going to live in a train tunnel like moles?" His wife Prudence was less amused and more horrified. "Sarah, dear, you can't be serious. It's dark, it's damp, it's like living in a tomb. What will people think?" "That we're warm and dry," Sarah replied, keeping her voice level. She'd learned from Thomas not to justify decisions to people who'd already made up their minds. The town's unofficial mayor, a prospector named Dutch Heinrich, shook his head. "Thomas, I know you worked tunnels, but living in one? The mountain could collapse. Those old railroad tunnels, they're not safe. That's why the company abandoned it." "They abandoned it because they ran out of money, not because the tunnel was failing," Thomas corrected. "The engineering is sound. I've inspected every foot of it." The local preacher, Reverend Kimball, took a different approach. "The Lord gave us the surface of the earth to dwell upon. Genesis speaks of man given dominion over creation, not told to hide inside it like animals fleeing light. There's something unnatural about choosing to live in perpetual shadow." Even sympathetic voices were doubtful. Martha Hutchins, one of the few other women in the settlement, tried to be kind. "Sarah, I understand wanting shelter from the cold up here, but couldn't you just build a proper cabin with thick walls? You'll go mad in the darkness, dear. Women need sunlight, fresh air, the sight of growing things." "We'll have windows," Sarah said, "and we'll be at the entrance, not buried in the mountain." But the label stuck. The Tunnel People. Some called it Brennan's Burrow. The children made up a song about living in the dark like bats. Even the sympathetic calls showed that the settlement had decided this was madness, desperation, or both. Construction began in late May, when the snow had finally cleared enough to haul materials. Thomas had worked enough tunnels to know exactly what they needed: good lumber for framing, plenty of nails, a reliable stove, and, most importantly, proper ventilation planning. The first task was clearing the tunnel section where they'd build. 100 feet from the entrance, the tunnel floor was covered with rock debris, standing water, and the detritus of abandoned construction. Thomas and Sarah spent 2 weeks with picks, shovels, and a wheelbarrow, removing debris and creating a level surface. "Why so much digging?" Sarah asked one evening, her hands blistered despite gloves. "Water management," Thomas explained. He'd created a slight slope toward the tunnel entrance, ensuring any seepage would drain away from their living space rather than pooling. "And we're down to solid granite now. Best foundation you could ask for." They'd marked out a space 20 feet wide and 16 feet deep, the width limited by the tunnel's dimensions, the depth by how much space they wanted. Thomas designed the structure to be built against the tunnel's south wall, leaving the north side open for passage and airflow. The framing went up in early June. Thomas had purchased good Douglas fir lumber, hauled up from Denver at considerable expense, $47 for dimensional timber, a significant portion of their savings, but worth it for quality material. The frame was conventional, post and beam construction, 4x4 corner posts set on flat stones for foundation, 2x6 wall studs spaced 16 inches apart for strength, and heavy headers over the window and door openings to carry roof loads. But unlike a freestanding cabin, one wall was the tunnel itself. Solid granite that needed no framing, only some smoothing where the stone was particularly rough. Thomas spent 2 full days with a hammer and chisel, knocking off protruding stone points and creating a relatively flat surface where the wooden frame would meet the mountain. It was tedious work, striking stone thousands of times, but essential for a tight fit. Where gaps remained between wood and stone, he'd pack them with a mixture of clay and straw, creating an insulating barrier against drafts. It's like building half a cabin, Sarah observed, watching the structure take shape. 3 walls of wood, 1 wall of mountain. The asymmetry was strange but elegant in its efficiency. Exactly, Thomas said, nailing a header beam with 8-penny nails driven at angles for maximum grip. And the mountain wall never needs repair, never rots, never burns. It's the best wall we could possibly have. In 100 years, when these wooden walls might need replacing, that granite will be exactly as it is today. He'd learned carpentry during his railroad days, watching crews build station buildings and worker housing. Now those skills came back. How to check corners for square using the 3-4-5 triangle method, how to ensure posts were plumb using a weighted string, how to sister beams together for extra strength. Each joint was checked twice, each measurement verified. At 10,000 feet, mistakes were expensive. The ceiling was more complex. Thomas didn't want simply to build flat up to the tunnel arch. That would create dead air space above them, wasting heat and creating potential moisture problems. Instead, he designed a pitched roof that would rise to about 12 feet at its peak, then stop well short of the tunnel arch. The gap is intentional, he explained to Sarah as they lifted the first rafter into place. Hot air rises. In winter, warm air from our stove will rise into that gap, circulate, and help maintain temperature. In summer, the same circulation will help keep us cool, and moisture can evaporate into the tunnel space rather than condensing on our ceiling. Sarah, who'd studied anatomy and understood circulation systems, grasped it immediately. It breathes. Everything should breathe, Thomas agreed. The roof boards went on next, rough-cut pine laid across the rafters and nailed down. Over this, Thomas spread a layer of tar paper for moisture protection, then added wooden shakes. It seemed excessive, a roof inside a tunnel protected from rain, but Thomas insisted. Condensation, he said. Cold granite overhead, warm air below, moisture will condense. This roof sheds it away from our living space into the tunnel, where it can drain naturally. The walls were board and batten construction, vertical planks with narrow strips covering the gaps. Thomas took extra care with the wall that faced the tunnel entrance, knowing that was where cold air and wind could penetrate. He doubled the planking there, creating an insulated barrier, and made sure the door fit tight. The door itself was a point of pride. 3 layers of planks crossing each other at angles, bound with iron straps Thomas had forged himself in Morrison's smithy. Heavy, solid, and fitted with a proper lock and hinges. Why such a fortress door? Sarah asked. Because everything else here is granite, Thomas said. This is the weak point. Has to be strong. Windows were the bigger challenge. Sarah had insisted on real windows, not just shutters or oiled paper. Thomas had agreed, but placement was tricky. The tunnel entrance faced northeast, which meant limited direct sunlight. He installed 2 windows in the wall facing the entrance, positioned to catch whatever light penetrated into the tunnel. Both were real glass, expensive, heavy panes hauled up from Denver in padded crates. It'll still be dim, he warned. Dimmer than a basement, brighter than a cave, Sarah said. We'll have lamps, and I'd rather have stone walls and dim light than bright windows and freezing drafts. The floor was Sarah's project. Thomas had leveled the granite, but she wanted something warmer underfoot than bare stone. They couldn't afford proper flooring boards for the entire space, so she designed a compromise. A wooden frame filled with smooth river stones set in sand, then covered with rag rugs she'd brought from Denver. The result was surprisingly attractive. A stone floor that didn't feel like stone. Thermal mass that would hold heat from the stove. The stove installation required careful planning. Thomas installed a small cast iron stove in the center of their living space, but the chimney was the challenge. In a normal cabin, a chimney simply rises through the roof. Here, the chimney had to rise 12 feet to the cabin's peaked roof, then angled to connect with a metal pipe that rose another 8 feet to reach the tunnel arch, then angled again to vent out a carefully drilled hole that Thomas had spent 3 days making in the tunnel's sidewall, about 20 feet up. "Why not just vent it straight out the tunnel entrance?" Sarah asked, watching him wrestle the final section of stovepipe into place. "Draft and backdraft," Thomas explained. "If we vented the entrance, winter winds could blow smoke back in. This way, the vent is protected and the draft is clean. The tunnel itself helps. Warm air rises and carries the smoke up and out." By late July, the structure was complete. From inside the tunnel, it looked like a small wooden house had been built against the granite wall, with a peaked roof and glass windows glowing with lamplight. From outside the tunnel entrance, you could barely see it, just a glimpse of wooden walls in the dimness, perhaps 80 feet back. They'd furnished it simply: a bed frame with rope supports and a straw tick mattress, a table and 2 chairs Thomas had built from leftover lumber, shelves along the granite wall for Sarah's books and their few possessions, and hooks for hanging clothes, tools, and cooking implements. The first night inside was strange. The silence was profound. The mountain absorbed sound, deadening echoes. The temperature was exactly as Thomas had predicted, 48 degrees, comfortable with blankets and the small fire in the stove. The darkness outside their windows was absolute, but inside, lamplight and firelight created a cozy glow. "It's quiet," Sarah said. "No wind," Thomas replied. "No creaking boards, no animals scratching at the walls. Just stone and silence." She found she liked it. After years in Denver, where noise was constant and privacy rare, the tunnel's profound quiet felt like luxury. The settlement's mockery didn't stop just because they'd built the place. If anything, it intensified when people realized they were actually living there. "How can you stand it?" Prudence Morrison asked when Sarah came to the store for supplies in August. "The darkness, the dampness, the unnaturalness of it all." "It's not damp," Sarah replied. "The tunnel drains well, and we have windows and lamps." "But don't you feel buried alive? Trapped?" Prudence shuddered dramatically. "I'd go mad within a week." Jacob Morrison was more practical in his criticism. "That tunnel wasn't meant for living, Thomas. It was meant for trains. What happens when the mountain shifts, when the stone cracks? You'll be crushed in your sleep." "The tunnel's been there 3 years without shifting," Thomas said. "The engineering is sound. Granite doesn't shift like soil." Dutch Heinrich, the prospector, had darker predictions. "Winter's coming, Thomas. Up here at 10,000 feet, winter isn't a joke. That tunnel will be colder than a tomb. You'll burn through all your firewood trying to heat stone, and it still won't be warm. You'll freeze or you'll suffocate from the smoke, or both." Even Reverend Kimball, usually measured in his judgments, expressed concern. "I've been praying for you both," he told them after Sunday service. "It troubles me, this choice to dwell in darkness. The Psalms speak of walking in the light of the Lord. What light can reach you in a tunnel?" "The same light that reaches everyone," Sarah said, surprising herself with her firmness. "We're still God's children, Reverend, whether we live in a cabin or a tunnel. Our walls are granite instead of pine, but our hearts are unchanged." The preacher had no good answer to that. Through the late summer and early autumn, Thomas and Sarah settled into their tunnel home. They developed routines. Sarah discovered that the constant temperature meant food preservation was easier. The granite wall space was like having a natural ice house. Milk stayed fresh for days. Meat kept longer. Vegetables stored in baskets along the granite wall didn't freeze or wilt. Thomas built additional furniture and improvements. A water collection system that caught the tunnel's minor seepage and filtered it through sand and charcoal for drinking water. A clever ventilation grate near the ceiling that could be opened or closed to regulate airflow. A workshop space farther back in the tunnel where he could work without disturbing Sarah. They acquired a dog, a stocky mutt named Granite, who seemed to love the tunnel as much as they did. He'd sleep against the stone wall, absorbing its coolness in summer, and curl by the stove in winter. Visitors were rare. Most of the settlement had written them off as eccentric at best, dangerously foolish at worst. But occasionally, someone would climb the trail to see this strange dwelling. They'd peer into the tunnel entrance, see the glow of windows and smoke rising from the angled chimney, and shake their heads in wonder or dismay. "Aren't you lonely up here?" Martha Hutchins asked on one visit, bringing a jar of preserved peaches as a gift. "No more lonely than we'd be in a cabin," Sarah said. "Perhaps less. The silence is companionable." Winter came to Hoosier Pass in October, early and hard. Snow fell in earnest, accumulating in deep drifts that buried everything more than a few feet high. The tunnel entrance became a cavern of ice, with massive icicles forming along the arch like a frozen portcullis. Snow piled 10 feet deep on the mountainside above. Inside, the tunnel temperature dropped slightly, from 48 degrees to about 42. Thomas and Sarah wore sweaters and kept the stove burning, but they weren't cold. The mountain's mass absorbed and held warmth from the stove, radiating it back gently. Their firewood consumption was a fraction of what a conventional cabin required. "We're using maybe a quarter of the wood Dutch predicted," Thomas said one evening, reviewing their supplies. "At this rate, we'll have wood to spare come spring." Down in Hoosier Junction, the settlement struggled. The altitude made everything harder. Water froze solid, firewood became precious, and keeping warm required constant effort. Several families burned through their winter wood supplies by December and had to trade precious goods for more fuel at inflated prices. But the real crisis came on January 15th, 1879. The avalanche started high on the mountain, triggered by a combination of heavy snow, warming temperatures, and wind loading on the cornices above. Thousands of tons of snow broke free and roared down the mountainside at terrifying speed, estimated later at over 80 miles per hour, gathering more mass as it descended, incorporating rock, trees, and everything in its path. Thomas and Sarah were inside their tunnel home when it hit. They heard it first, a sound like continuous thunder, growing louder by the second, a rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah looked up from the book she was reading, and Granite, the dog, began to whine, pressing himself against her legs. "Thomas?" she said, fear creeping into her voice. Then the tunnel entrance went dark as the avalanche passed directly over it, burying the opening under 30 feet of compacted snow and debris. The sound was deafening even through the mountain, a roar like the end of the world. Their windows, facing the entrance, showed only white as snow slammed past. The floor trembled slightly. Dust fell from the ceiling beams, and then, after perhaps 20 seconds that felt like eternity, silence. Total, absolute silence. For a moment, Sarah's heart stopped. They were buried, trapped under countless tons of snow, with the mountain above them and darkness all around. She felt her breath come short, panic rising. "We're sealed in," she whispered. Then Thomas lit a lamp calmly, his railroad engineer's mind already assessing the situation. "We're all right," he said, though his hand shook slightly as he lifted the lamp. "The tunnel structure held. No collapse, no breach. We have air. The ventilation system is working. See the flame burn steady. And we're not sealed in. The snow covered the entrance, but the tunnel extends 500 feet through the mountain. We can dig out through the ventilation shaft, or wait for the snow to settle and clear the entrance." He was right, though proving it took effort. The ventilation shaft, Thomas's carefully planned emergency measure, was 30 feet back from the entrance and angled up through the tunnel wall to emerge 20 feet up the mountainside. Thomas climbed up using handholds he'd carved into the granite wall, reached the shaft, and after an hour of careful work, broke through to daylight. The hole was small, barely 18 inches across, but it provided fresh air, light, and the certainty that they weren't entombed. Over the next 3 days, they took turns enlarging the ventilation hole and beginning to tunnel through the snow blocking the main entrance. It was slow, dangerous work. The snow was compacted hard as ice, interlaced with broken trees and rocks. They had to work carefully, shoring up the tunnel as they went with boards, creating a narrow passage. Sarah worked as hard as Thomas, her nurse's hands now bloody and blistered from gripping shovels and picks. They had food, water, warmth, and most importantly, air. The tunnel had protected them completely. Down in Hoosier Junction, the avalanche had been catastrophic. It had missed the main settlement but had swept through the upper homesteads where 3 families had built cabins on the mountainside, thinking the elevation and view were worth the exposure. The Carlson cabin had been completely destroyed, the family barely escaping with their lives. The Peterson place had been swept off its foundation and scattered down the mountain. The Sullivan family had lost their barn, their livestock, and nearly lost their children when the avalanche hit at dawn. When Thomas and Sarah finally dug out and made their way down to the settlement 5 days later, they'd waited for conditions to stabilize. They found the survivors sheltering in Morrison's store and the church, traumatized and grieving. Jacob Morrison saw them first. His face, haggard from days of rescue efforts, showed a complex mixture of relief and embarrassment. "Thomas, Sarah, thank God you're alive. We thought, when we saw the avalanche path went right over the tunnel entrance." "The tunnel held," Thomas said simply. "We were never in danger." The survivors from the destroyed cabins stared. The Carlsons, who'd lost everything but their lives. The Petersons, whose home had been obliterated. The Sullivans, still searching for their livestock in the snow. Dutch Heinrich spoke first, his voice rough. "You were buried for 5 days." "We were sheltered for 5 days," Thomas corrected. "Warm, dry, safe. The mountain protected us." Prudence Morrison began to cry, though whether from relief or the stress of the past week, Sarah couldn't tell. "We were so wrong," she said. "We called you mad, and you were the smart ones all along." Reverend Kimball approached, his usually stern face showing humility. "Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Brennan, I owe you an apology. I spoke of dwelling in darkness as if it were a sin, but you built wisely. The mountain became your refuge, not your tomb. Perhaps there's more than one way to seek shelter under God's creation." In the weeks that followed, the settlement's attitude changed completely. The Carlsons and Petersons, unable to rebuild on their destroyed homesteads, asked Thomas about the abandoned railroad tunnels farther up the pass. Were any others suitable for conversion? Could he teach them the technique? Dutch Heinrich, the prospector who'd predicted their freezing death, visited the tunnel home and marveled at its efficiency. "You're heating maybe 400 cubic feet with that little stove," he said, examining their setup. "I'm heating 2,000 cubic feet with a stove 3 times that size, and still freezing at night. The engineering..." It's brilliant, Thomas. By spring, 3 more families had begun converting sections of the abandoned tunnel into homes. Thomas advised on ventilation, drainage, and construction. Sarah shared her techniques for food storage and managing the constant cool temperature. A journalist from the Denver newspaper came up in April, wanting to write about the tunnel dwellers of Hoosier Pass. The article was sympathetic, even admiring, describing the innovative use of abandoned infrastructure, the engineering principles that made it work, and the vindication of the Brennans' unconventional choice. They were called fools for hiding in a mountain, the article concluded. But when the mountain itself tried to kill their neighbors, their foolish shelter proved the wisest choice of all. Sometimes innovation looks like madness, until the test comes. On a clear day in late May, 1 year after they'd started construction, Thomas and Sarah stood at the tunnel entrance, looking out over the valley. Spring was transforming the mountain, wildflowers pushing through the melting snow. The avalanche path was still visible, a scar of broken trees and raw earth, but life was returning. Behind them, their tunnel home was warm and dry. The windows glowed with afternoon light. Smoke rose from the angled chimney, dissipating into the mountain air. Granite, the dog, dozed on the threshold, content. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "Choosing this instead of a conventional cabin?" Sarah thought about the winter, the avalanche, the profound security she'd felt, knowing that tons of snow and rock above them had been powerless to harm them. She thought about the constant temperature, the efficient heating, the way the mountain had become not a barrier, but a shelter. "Not for a moment," she said. Below them, the settlement of Hoosier Junction was rebuilding. But now, mixed among the conventional cabins, were tunnel homes, innovative dwellings carved into or built inside the mountain's bones, using the earth itself as protection and insulation. The railroad that had started the tunnel would never be completed. The company was long bankrupt, the route abandoned. But the tunnel had found a different purpose, not carrying trains through the mountain, but sheltering lives within it. "How long do you think it'll last?" Sarah asked, running her hand along the granite arch. Thomas considered. The stonework was competent, the tunnel well engineered. Granite was essentially eternal on human timescales. 100 years, easily, maybe more. Long after every wooden cabin in the valley has rotted away, this stone will still be standing. He was right, though neither of them would live to see it. The tunnel home would stand for 93 years before finally being incorporated into a state park as a historical site. Visitors would come to see the pioneer tunnel dwelling, marveling at the ingenuity of people who'd looked at an abandoned industrial remnant and seen not failure, but possibility. But in that moment, in May of 1879, Thomas and Sarah simply stood together at the entrance to their home, watching spring return to the high country. They'd been called mad, unnatural, foolish. They'd been predicted to freeze, to suffocate, to be crushed. Instead, they'd survived what had destroyed others. They'd turned mockery into vindication, abandonment into innovation, and a dark tunnel into a bright future. The mountain stood solid behind them, and within it, their home waited. Warm, dry, and permanent as stone.